Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Good afternoon. Yes.
Thanks, Sunil. Good to see you all. Okay, so welcome to week 3, module 3 in CSE4 cybersecurity principles. We are in week 3, and the module 3 covers a few GRC related concepts, including risk management and incident response, business continuity planning, and so on. So it's a mix of topics, but very much related to how to prepare for incidents and what to do when incidents already happen. So these are largely under the governance, risk, and compliance. So if you have previously played a role in an organization, then you would have some familiarity with these concepts, and these are all welcome concepts. This is something that you use in everyday life. It's just a little bit of looking from the perspective of information security or cybersecurity. Okay, so for the first part, we'll be looking at cybersecurity risk management, and this is the main source of information that we'll be following. This is Principles of Information Security by Michael Whitman and Herbert Matter. And there is a link over here which you can follow or probably search it after logging into your library account. And this might give you a copy of an online version of it. But most of this content has been already curated on our LMS. But despite that, I also have made available just the chapter 4 of that book through an official digitization process at the university. And I will also make that PDF available from the LMS along with the PowerPoint presentations that we will upload soon after. So remember that we'll be following that book, and the content from the book has been taken to produce the content, the LMS, as well as this PowerPoint slide. Okay, so now just to have an overall view of these things, we're looking at a risk management process. And the risk management process has a number of elements to it, and they're interconnected to each other. Basically, 3 verticals. As you can see, risk management has risk identification, risk assessment, and risk control, and happens in this order. And for risk identification phase, you have a number of distinct phases of that risk identification phase, including identification, inventory of assets, classification of those assets in terms of the values, identifying and prioritizing threats to those assets, and specifying specific asset vulnerabilities. And this is all moved to the next one. This is required for the next part, where you, as part of the risk assessment process, this can be both a combination of qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. We'll be looking at the quantitative aspect of it as well as a qualitative part of it. So here you can see we're determining the loss frequency. This is a quantitative metric. This is the likelihood. We also identify and estimate the impact or the magnitude of the loss. Both from these, we can calculate the risk. And based on this risk, we sort of identify the most important assets and the threats, and then containerize them as one risk. So once we have all the list of risks, then we prioritize those risks that needs to be addressed, are mitigated, and there are different phases of risk mitigation or risk control. We'll be looking at the risk control strategies. But then there will be some risks that are acceptable for us. For example, when you go outside, we travel by car or in a vehicle, we accept the risk that there will be an accident, right? There might be an accident, or some impairment during the journey that will not allow us to reach from A to B safely. So that is a risk that we accept, and that's why we go onto the roads. How about risk of air travel? There are risks associated with air travel too. It could be that there's a malfunction of the plane. There could be a lot of different problems in the geopolitical situation. You can't mid-flight, you may have to return, and so on. So there are also risks associated with air travel. But when we're looking at risk assessment, given the risk posture of an organization, we'd like to ideally rank those risks according to most risky to least risky. So can anyone say, anecdotally speaking, which one is more risky, an air travel or travel by road? Road, yes, almost universally. And I can read Y road as road too, Jade. So thanks for that. Okay. Yeah. So yes, absolutely. And how do we know that? Is it just a gut feeling because we hear more about the road accidents than the air accidents? Although, admittedly, some of the air accidents are very fatal and really, they catch the eye and the news, but statistics, correct. So we gather this information from statistics, and that's what guides us in our understanding of what's the likelihood of a particular threat. Okay. And the last part is risk control, where for the risks that we cannot sort of accept, we need to figure out what to do with them, right? And there are kind of strategies we'll be going through. Okay. So in the first phase, we can see that the most important thing is risk identification, right? So what is risk identification? Is examination and documentation of the security posture of an organization. And risk assessment is basically the determination of the extent to which the organization's information assessment are exposed to risk. So this is basically what I just described in the slide before. These are just definitions. Now, this
Sorry,
is an
Doctor. Sorry if I missed it in the beginning, but so is this risk management process something that happens as a continuous process throughout the organization's life, or like is it something you should do
Oh,
at
very good,
particular
very good
stages?
question. Yes, yes. So this is an iterative process. You'll see in the next slide, you can see these iterations. You do this, and then you go back to each of them. So this is an iterative process where, first of all, when you are setting up a business or an organization, you need to do a risk assessment of whether the risk environment poses a terminal threat for your venture. In many cases, they bail out. And we'll talk about those strategies later on. But yes, you should not only do it at the beginning of when you're setting up the organization, but also as part of your daily risk assessment routine. So that means risk assessment for cybersecurity is basically what cybersecurity is all about. So in the traditional sense, we call it risk assessment and risk control. In cybersecurity, although a lot of different technical aspects are there, the thing that we are essentially doing is risk management. We are managing risks in an inherently risky environment where we cannot guarantee that we'll be safe. And we talked about these things in previous lectures, why we cannot be safe, because in order to be truly safe, we need to be completely air gapped. And that doesn't allow us to function in an inter-network way. That is the most fundamental difficulty of internet. Now, this slide is important because here we talk about risk appetite, residual risk, and so on. So we have to understand this. There's a subtle There's a nuanced understanding of this. What is desirable risk level? So first of all, understand the fact that not all risks can be mitigated or avoided, right? Because of the eventuality that we mentioned. So therefore, an organization must define the level of risk that it is willing to live with. And that informs the shareholders, the clients, the stakeholders of the company about the risk appetite of that company or organization. So risk appetite is basically defines the quantity and nature of risk that this organization is willing to accept. And for example, defense will defense, security organizations, sensitive government organizations, and financial organizations. Do you think they have a high risk appetite or a low risk appetite? Low, right? Yeah, correct. So they have a low risk appetite because they don't want to take risks, right? They want to avoid risk as much as possible. How about the other way around? In this, if you draw a line segment from very low risk appetite to high risk appetite, what would be some examples at the higher end? Crypto traders, okay. Stock trading, crypto trading, insurance companies. I'm not sure whether insurance companies are risk takers. They actually mitigate risks. So we'll talk about that part later. So yes, currency trading, extreme sports, right? Venture capitalists. Yes, most financial institutions. Gambling. Gambling. How about gambling? Nobody talked about that. Gambling is even under a legal framework, gambling is extremely risk prone, right? But if it pays off, you get a lot of money. But you accept the risk that you're going to lose most of the time, right? So this is a spectrum of risks, and you need to be able to identify. Um, yes, no. If Jade, if you're talking about, let's say, gambling being high risk for customers but low risk for running the business, that's true to some extent, but there are regulatory risks. For example, we know about Crown Casino, right? In an Australian context, we know that it underwent a lot of scrutiny, and some of its activities were questioned and even fined. And at some point, it was people are thinking it will be going down. So there are risks to such activities, whether it's enabling people to take on risk or not. Sam, yes? Sam, did you have a question or a comment? We can't hear you. Okay, we'll just maybe just Sam will write something down. Okay. Now, okay, so now if a company, an organization understands its risk posture, then what it's trying to do is bring those risky things, mitigate those risky things to the extent that whatever risk remains, which is known as the residual risk, is something that they're happy to live with. Okay? So, yeah, so this residual risk is basically, yeah. No, Sam. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So Sam is saying that insurance companies buy other people's risks to make money. Yeah, that's correct. But they have a risk as well. For example, if they're insuring something that's supposed to happen, for example, in southern Queensland, some areas were extremely flood prone, and floods over there were originally having a rating of 1 in 100, but this 1 in 100 flood happened in consecutive years. So there goes their statistics out of the window, right? And then they have to recalculate all of these things so that now they will think twice or make it even more difficult for customers to be able to insure their properties. And in some cases, they will not insure at all. So you see, even the insurance companies are risk averse. They want to avoid risky business because they understand what's at stake, right? So, but yeah, that's the thing. So the important thing to realize is that the goal of the information security for us in computer science and cybersecurity is we don't want to bring the residual risk to zero. We don't want to make it zero, but the residual risk will be brought down to our risk appetite level. So if we are risk averse, we have extremely low risk, then we'd like to bring the residual risk to a level that we are happy with and our industry supports that. Okay, so that's the most important thing that to take away from this. Any questions regarding this?
Yeah, maybe just probably a silly one, but what makes you say that, bringing the risk down to zero is not what you want to do?
Because it's impossible to do so. We cannot bring the risk level down to zero. As I said before, as the context to it, in information security, especially in the interconnected nature of the information security, the only means of doing it is completely air-gapped and not having functionalities that offer us, that opportunity of being risk averse. So, yeah, so we cannot do business with zero risk. We accept there are risks and we take the actions to mitigate those risks. Okay. All right. So to give you an example, so when people say risk can be eliminated, it's not possible to eliminate risk. For example, if you have physical risk, and I don't want to go into much more detail because so many things to cover. I just want to say, let's say there are physical risks. Any organization would have a physical risk, correct? And that physical risk can be accounted for in your overall risk assessment. So, but in many cases, we avoid, calculating physical risk because physical risk cannot be avoided. There can be an earthquake. There can be a tsunami. There can be a sinkhole. So these are in God's hand, right? So basically, in nature's way, you're not at the risk. The whole thing can be eliminated. The whole earth can be destroyed. There is a non-zero probability that the earth will be hit by a meteorite.
Can I give you an example? Excuse me. Can I give you an example? So, for instance, you have a meeting, which is, say, so you are in Brisbane and the meeting is in Sydney. How you can eliminate the risk of the travel? You can have a virtual meeting. So this is an elimination of the travel risk.
It is not an elimination. You are just discounting the fact that there are further risks to having an online meeting. Internet can go down, your power can go down.
No, I'm talking about the physical. So it is a risk to get injured. So if you want to eliminate the injury of a travel, you have an online meeting. This is elimination.
That's the elimination of that risk.
That risk, yes.
But what you're proposing in online meeting will have other risks. So we are not talking about a specific risk.
But
we are talking about the overall risks. Risks of
the overall risk. I agree with you. I agree with you. However, if you take the risks individually, you have measures to mitigate, to eliminate the risk,
or even avoid.
Transfer the risk. So avoid.
Or even avoid. Yeah, but I was trying to make a simple point. We live in a risk environment. We cannot be completely
I totally agree with you. The overall risk you cannot minimize, but individual risks you can eliminate the risks or to transfer risks.
You don't even need to eliminate. So we'll be talking about risk control, and it will become clearer. We don't always even need to eliminate risk.
Yeah.
All right. So basically, this is the kind of thing that we wanted to talk about. That our goal is not to bring the risk to zero, but to bring it to a level that we are happy with, and this is called the residual risk. Okay. Now, the first phase of the risk assessment is risk identification. And in risk identification, we sort of start with planning and organization, and then we move into identification and inventory classification. I described this before, so let's move on. Okay, so asset identification is something that we have described before. Remember in NIST CSF identification, right? And also in CIS controls, the first two controls are identification of assets, hardware assets, and software assets. So these are all very well-known concepts. Identification of assets is the first part to risk assessment. But what we do further than that, a little bit extra, here is we also value our assets, meaning we sort of evaluate how important this is this asset. Okay, so to give an example, imagine that you have a server room, right? A room full of servers and machines. Okay, and you can say each of these servers cost me X amount of money, right? Let's say $2,000. Each server cost me $2,000. So apparently that is your valuation, correct? But what if some servers are worth more than others for the business to survive? For example, there may be, as an extreme example, there may be some servers out of the 10 servers, maybe 2 servers are sitting on the floor doing nothing, right? So if they're doing nothing, they're not even connected, they're not doing anything. So basically, maybe it's worth 2,000 at the valuation, at the face value of the price, but the other servers may be more costly to replace, repair, or even to service. So basically, asset valuation depends on the business objectives and the roles that the assets play towards the business objectives and process. We need to keep that in mind, okay? Okay, here is an example of a simple table of assets: people, procedures, data, software, hardware, everything is an asset, okay? And you can see that this is a, simple thing. We'll not be looking into such broad classes of assets, maybe more specific to the scenarios. So what are people, procedures, data and assets, and data assets? You know that, right? So who does what? Why is a user account more important than another user account? Why, for example, some data could be more important than others. There's classified data, there are unclassified data. There are the data perhaps related to your intellectual properties that are more important to secure than others. So we need to be able to specify those things, and that can only happen once we have classified our data, right? So these are the kind of things that organizations use to maintain a list of the assets, asset attributes, procedures attributes, data attributes. Okay, so these are some further examples of what are the information of or attributes are needed to identify whether a hardware software network is important. Okay. And how do you do that? You do that by asset classification, classifying the components in ways of maintaining the priority level. So you can provide the priority levels of assets. So that's what we talked about. So here are some of the questions that you asked, right? I gave an example of the server room. Those are the kind of you ask. Which asset is the most critical to the organization's success? Which one generates the most revenue? Which one has the most profit? Which one would be the most difficult to replace? Which one would be the most expensive to protect? So that's another consideration. So maybe you have an asset that will add some value, while the assets add some value to your business, but maybe protecting it, or you have to spend so much money to protect it, maybe it's not worth keeping it in the first place, right? So then you think about whether this asset should be replaced with a lower value asset that can be, sort of protected cheaply, or you talk about other risk control, for example, transference or risk avoidance and so on. And the last one, what would be the most embarrassing or cause the greatest liability if revealed? So in today's world, that's also another consideration to be had, especially for governments and defense and sensitive organizations. Sometimes they don't want to reveal certain information for their own protection or for whatever reason they want to hide it. And if this gets leaked, this gets widely informed, then they have to do some face-saving measures or just have to accept culpability or liability. Okay.
But Doctor,
Yep.
sorry, when we're evaluating the assets, are these questions we have to just come up with ourselves? Or is there like a nice checklist or guidance or template that we could follow?
There are big volumes of books dedicated to risk assessment processes, right? You've got ISO 27001, ISO 27005. You've got other risk assessment. If you do C-Risk, which is a certification on risk assessment, you can do a lot of different things. But for the purpose of and the scope of this subject, we just ask these simple questions that help us to understand. Basically,
Okay.
When we're doing risk assessment in an organization, it starts off at the top, right? We did the NIST CSF. If you do the NIST CSF, that's basically a kind of risk assessment exercise as well, because you start at the very top of the company and organization and identify the business goals and objectives. And then according to the business processes, you identify those risks. And the kind of questions you ask is not something you answer alone or you can answer alone. Rely on others. Those who are, doing those business processes on an everyday basis, you talk to them. What are the risks? What do you think is a problem? They may not understand the technical details, but they will tell you, okay, if the internet goes down, I will be affected by that amount of loss, right? Because not every part of the organization knows every other detail. So from the perspective of risk assessment, you need to talk to them together and individually to figure out which aspects of. So a small example would give you an understanding. So here, this is an example of what we call asset relative value table. And you can find this in, this is a weighted factor analysis, but what we essentially want to get to is an asset value in a ranked order. Now, you can find this in detail in chapter 4 Whitman, the one that we'll be uploading later on. I will probably show you after I go through this PowerPoint slides how that chapter looks and so on. But this is essentially brought from that book. So here's some business processes of an organization. And you can see each information asset is assigned a score for each of a set of assigned criteria, okay, or critical factor. And in this example, you can see that there are 3 assigned critical factors, and each asset is assessed a score for each of the critical factors. So here, you can see the score ranges from 0.1 to 1, right? There is no 0.1 here. Is there a 0.1 here? But anyway, it ranges from 0.1 because 0, we do not use any values of 0 here. So here you can see what we do is we identify some criteria. The criteria could be impact to revenue, impact to profitability, impact to public image, or in your case, it could be the CIA triad. So it could be confidentiality, impact to integrity, impact to availability, or you can add few more criteria as you wish, whichever the objectives of that companies. But in this case, what they're showing is that they're assigning the relative importance of these criteria. So the most important for this organization is profitability. So they put 40% here. And then the impact to revenue and the public image is equal, 30-30 each. So all of them should add up to 100. These three or whatever, however many criterion you have got, they need to add up to 100. And the rows are basically either your business processor or your assets. So in this case, these are business processes. So here you can see that this business process has an impact of 80% to revenue, has an impact of 90% to profitability, has an impact of 50% to public image, because public image is also very important for a brand name and so on. So it doesn't have much effect. What is this? It's the EDI document set 1 logistics bill of lading to outsourcer outbound. So you're basically sending a bill to an outsourcer. From the outsourcer, you're procuring the goods and then you're selling as a retailer, something like that, right? I don't know about the whole thing, but that's what I can figure out from this. So if you multiply this, if you factorize this, so basically 30 times 0.8 is 24, 40 times 0.9 is 36, and 30 times 0.5 is 15. Add them together, that gives you 75. This is the weighted score of this business process. Now, if you consider all the rest, then you'll see some of them have a very high score. For example, customer order via secure socket layer inbound. So what happens is you have a website like Amazon, you're selling something to the customers, and if the customers cannot give you the orders, if the customers cannot send you the orders, which means what? You have lost the revenue, right? You can't take the order and you cannot fulfill the order. You're not making any money. At the same time, you're racking up your expenses. So this is vitally important. This affects your revenue. This affects your profitability. And also this affects your public image because your website is unavailable, basically, right? So this is the most important thing. And you can see it's ranked at 100. The lowest one is a set to supplier fulfillment advice inbound. I'm not absolutely sure what that really means, but this basically doesn't affect the business process immediately. This can take time, and this will have a lower impact on everything. Nobody else will get to know because it's another supplier. It doesn't have any or little effect on public image. Profitability is 50-50 and so on. So now if you have this, you can order this and you can find the most critical asset or business process is this one. The next critical one is this one. And the third one is this, and so on. At the very end will be this one, right? So in some cases, when you have a large number of assets or business processes and a large number of threads and so on, when you order them, you can say, all right, I'll have a cutoff of 50% or 60% and so on. And below that, we do not even take those assets into account, right? Because they're weighted so much less. So this is how we develop a weighted factor analysis. Once again. All right, someone asked, how are the criteria weights determined? As you see fit, there is no hard and fast rule. This is very symmetrical because there are only 3 criterion, and they value profitability as most businesses would. But not every organization is a business, so therefore some may have more weightage to public image or revenue. If you want to do a CIA triad as well along with this, then you may want to assign accordingly, correct? Now, remember though, if you want to add other criterion along with it, not every criterion will be mutually exclusive, right? Even here, revenue and profitability may be interrelated to each other, right? Not always, but in most cases, if you increase in revenue, that might also increase in profitability, given the expenses are the same. But they have little or no effect on public image, right? Unless you're a not-for-profit company, for example, like OpenAI was, and you want to be a for-profit company, that may have a public image impact, but not all the time. Yeah. So whatever you want to do it's basically based on your organization's worldview of things and how they want to cater for any stakeholder questions and so on, right? Next one. Next, we go to threat. So next step is, once we have identified and categorized or ranked the assets according to the relative values, in other words, the asset relative value ranking, then we move on to threat. So we need to identify all the threats that exist in our business operating scenario. Now, you could be in a financial organization and you'll be looking at the risk associated with the financial industry. You could be in critical services. It could be ambulance, it could be hospitals, it could be power system, and you have a different kind of threat scenario, right? Or you could be, any other government or other organization. They have different threat scenarios. There are some threats that are common across the board for any information security, but there are other specific threats that are sort of peculiar to that organization or industry. So you need to be able to identify that. And in some cases, industry bodies put out statements about what are the risks to the operating environment. And this could be a good source of information for you when you're trying to identify threats. Plus, information technology companies, like say Microsoft, Symantec, and so on, they also publish threat scenarios periodically. So let's say they have an annual report on the kind of threats they see from their endpoints. So for example, there are millions, if not billions, of Microsoft Windows installations worldwide, and they are receiving threat telemetry from these endpoints. And what kind of risks do they see, right? And sometimes they also identify risk in terms of the business type or the industry type. So this kind of risk reports are also useful for you to identify risk in a particular threat environment. So this is just a very old and general type of threats, act of human error, forces of nature, I mentioned to those things, and blackmail. So these are just traditional threats. But of course, nowadays you've got other threats. You've got malware, and we talked about threats in week 1, right? In module 1, we talked about threats. Hackers are threats, malwares are threats, different kinds of attacks. Whoever originates, these are called threat actors. But a threat could be basically what happens. What is the threat to the business operations you've got, right? It's a statement. It's basically a threat. It's a statement. The statement might say that the threat is my database server goes down, right? But then you need to also qualify it using saying, okay, it can go down in various ways, and these are basically the reasons that it can go down. Someone can turn off the switch. It's a physical threat. Someone can actually perform a DDoS attack on this one. So this is also a threat. So for every unwanted incident, there may be one or more threat and threat actors. So you need to identify those threats. Next is, which is a related topic to threat identification. In fact, you can actually talk about threat and the vulnerability in the same sentence, and sometimes even interchangeably so. But for the purpose of this exercise, because we want to control the risks, it's important to identify what are we trying to control. One of the points of control is removing or reducing the vulnerabilities, right? So specifically in cases of when we talk about software or IT infrastructure, we look into vulnerabilities. So these are weaknesses, as we mentioned before in module 1. Vulnerabilities are examples of weaknesses in our assets or operating procedures. These weaknesses, if exploited, can lead to risks, manifested risks. So one example of vulnerability could be that your softwares are outdated. If the softwares are outdated, that means there are newer attack techniques that are not actually protected. These softwares are not protected from these newer attack techniques, right? So some software have built-in protection. Some softwares have code that needs to be reviewed and patched. So that those patching has not happened yet. So the vulnerabilities remain. So we need to identify the vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned before, the vulnerabilities only exist in relation to a threat and asset pair, right? A threat and asset pair. Vulnerability is the thing that connects a threat and an asset, right? So remember, I think we discussed about this example. Did we ever talk about a house with some asset in it, for example, gold? If there is a house and there is some asset like gold in it, and let's say there is a vulnerability like an open window, and the threat could be someone stealing the gold asset from that home, right? Did we discuss this? Yeah. So correct. So basically here, if we just imagine and visualize this scenario of an empty house with not empty house, I mean, no, there's no one inside, but there is asset inside like gold bars, and there is an open window, which is a vulnerability, and the threat actor is thief, and the threat is that the threat is that the thief may steal the gold, right? So in that case, the threat is basically exploiting the vulnerability that there is an open window. Okay, does it make sense? And one way of controlling this risk could be that you have you have a closed window, right? For example, a lock in the window, or you could have a guard dog that would chase the thief away, right? So these are examples of steps you can take to control the risks. In this particular case, if you have, let's say, a guard dog, what kind of control is this? Is it a preventive control or a detective control? It's a preventive control, right? Yeah. You could also have an IP camera set with it, saying that, look, this is recording. This is recording your what do you call it, actions. So be aware. What kind of control is that? Well, it can be a preventive control and it can also be a detective control. But it's only a detective control if the IP camera is actually working. I mean, you can go to Amazon or eBay, you can buy fake IP cameras because nobody's actually spending a lot of money trying to fix an IP camera. All this installation is there, but you can still be broken into. People wearing masks, home invasion, and you still lose the money. And when the cops come and ask you, you just provide them with the generic feed, which has no particular information they can trace to. I'm not saying it's not valuable or useful. Of course, it is useful and valuable. But for the purpose of mitigating the risk, it's not doing much, because those who are going to break in are going to break in regardless. But you have saved the money of installing an expensive IP camera, because although it's not doing the detective part, it's still doing the preventive part, because there's no way that someone can figure out whether this IP camera is actually working or not. Does it make sense? Okay. So remember that we now have to do, after we have identified the assets, identified the threats, rank them, and then we have identified the scenarios under which we can be exploited, like the vulnerabilities, we need to create a threat vulnerability asset matrix. And we'll see examples of those later on. So here's an example of how vulnerability assessment of typical router, for example. So what are the threats to a router? Compromises to intellectual property. How? Copyrighted works, developed in-house and stored on internet servers can be copied without permission unless the router is configured to limit access from outside. So basically, It's got talking about access control. You have forces of nature. All information is subject to force of nature unless suitable controls are provided. Human error, someone can actually turn this router off, causing availability issues, and so on. So I'm not saying this is the perfect example, but anyway, so this is, it was one of those old examples for routers. Routers used to play, as still does, they do play an important role in network configuration. But now the question is, at what level are you going to look at your assets, right? Again, it all comes from your asset relative value analysis. You can look at assets at a very high level. For example, you can think about the whole organization as an asset, single asset, right? But it's very difficult to control risks when you're talking about just a single large entity. Therefore, you need to break it down to more, I would say, compartmental parts so that each of these can be now sort of controlled. The risk can be controlled for each of these. So maybe router might come into play, but it may not. Maybe you're talking about the whole network as an asset, and then you can apply risk control for your network. Okay. Next comes, so this is how a sample, a threat vulnerability asset matrix or spreadsheet looks like. So pay attention. So you can see that here we have a list of assets in the column, right? So the question was, is it being recorded? Yes. Thank you for having an eye lookout. Yes, it is being recorded. And the assets are from range 1 to n here. Let's say that asset 1 is more important than asset 2. So this is also the asset importance or relative importance of assets in decreasing order of importance. So asset 1 is more important than asset 2 and so on. And also you've got threats here, right? Let's say the most important threat is 1 and least important threat is n, and then you have written this in this way. So now, whenever the asset 1 and threat 1 meets, that cell contains the vulnerabilities that exist for that asset and that threat. So let's say if the threat is a malware and the asset is your web server, then how many different operational ways that make sense for your business can that threat exploit your web server? Okay, so you write that here. So that vulnerability would basically be a statement that this is how your web server asset is being compromised or exploited by the threat malware, right? Of some type of, and maybe there are two different ways. Let's say one could be, a confidentiality attack. It can reveal and exfiltrate data, or it could be denial of service attack, attacking the availability. Whatever the thing is, you identify them and write them in this way, okay? So those, and next one, asset 2, for the same threat malware can also affect your database, right? Maybe it will affect it differently. So, and how differently does it affect? Those vulnerabilities needs to be mentioned here. Once you do those, fill this thing up, you will notice that the most important risks are on the top part of your asset matrix. So if you consider this as a diagonal, then above the diagonal are the most important. Why? Because these are the most important assets and these are the most important threats. And therefore, you can consider all of these as important risks to consider. While the remaining one, maybe there are least important assets and least important threats. So you can consider them as acceptable risks. Y Jen asks, what is T1, V1, A1, V1? So I mentioned this. V1 is vulnerability 1. So what's one of the vulnerabilities? There may be more than one vulnerability, right? The vulnerability, as I mentioned before, it could be lack of updates. That could be a vulnerability. Okay. All clear so far? And this is also very important. Yeah.
I might have missed it. How do you like order the assets again?
The assets are for the most important to the least important assets.
I see. Okay.
Makes sense. Okay. Now, this is a summary of how people do this, is risk taxonomy, right? And you can see the next stage we're going to look into how to calculate loss event frequency, probable loss magnitude, and this can be broken down. So don't worry too much about this. We'll go into some examples. Okay, risk assessment. How do we assign a risk rating or score to each information asset, right? So first we determine the loss frequency, then we evaluate the loss magnitude, which is also known as the impact, and then from both of these we can calculate the risk, and then we identify whether this risk is acceptable or not. Basically, if it's below the diagonal or far away from what you think is your acceptable risk, is you can ignore those risks. But the rest of the risk, you need to mitigate them. Okay, so Rick and whoever asked the question before about the assessment, we will be discussing, if we have time today, we'll be discussing about the assessment as well, because now this is the background, so you can actually correlate it with your assessment too. Again, it's already there in the assessment page. Okay, so here is a way of risk determination. You calculate loss frequency as the likelihood of the event times the probability of success. The loss magnitude is what given the original value of the asset, what is the exposure factor? How much of your asset would be lost in value, right? So let's say you have a web page, and the web page earns you some money, right? So it has a value associated, let's say $1 million. And then if there is an event that affects that asset, what is the percentage of the value of the asset that will be diminished from this threat? So that's your percentage of loss, also known as exposure factor. Excuse me. And that will give you a single loss magnitude, right? Magnitude of a single loss, right? And then you multiply it with loss frequency to get an annual loss. And we'll look at this once. So the worksheet is basically an asset relative value, vulnerability, loss frequency, loss magnitude, and so on. Let's go here. Okay, so this is known as a ranked vulnerability worksheet. The ranked vulnerability worksheet is basically where you sort of quantify how much loss you're expecting from the event. Remember that vulnerability you mentioned in the TVA1? Right? So now is that was a qualitative assessment. Now you're quantifying it. I want to be more specific about how much that loss is. Why is it important? Why is it important to assign some quantity of loss due to risks? Can anyone say that? Why is it important to quantify risk in terms of value?
So we can measure the risk and
Yeah, we can also measure risk qualitatively, high impact risk and medium impact risk and low impact risk. But here we're going a step further to put a value to the loss. Why is it worth doing a value-based loss, a risk calculation based on values? There you go, Maddie. Well done. So it's basically for the next step, not for this step now. In the next step, when you're going to control the risk, how much should we actually spend to control the risk? If it comes out that we need to spend more than the value of the asset to control the risk, is it worth controlling the risk? Can anyone say that? It's about the control. So if you do not quantify, in terms of dollar value or an amount that you need to be spending for that risk, when that risk happens, how much it costs you. If you do not quantify that, then how do you know that the measure that you're going to take to mitigate the risk is worthwhile? It's worth the risk. It's worth doing it, right? And that's why we need to quantify the risk. Okay, so for the next step, so this is what they do. They put the asset relative values. They put the loss frequency, loss magnitude. Now you might ask, where do you get these values, right? So of course, this is not an exact science. It is for insurance companies because they have to do it all the time, right? Like actuaries, I think they're called actuaries, right? And they paid a lot of money to do this. But of course, there's a science behind it. Again, everything comes from probabilities and statistics. How many times does a road accident happen compared to an air accident, right? That can be a basis of your loss frequency. The loss magnitude is basically an estimation. Okay, so if this loss happens for this duration, then my company will lose this amount of money because my average income over a day is this much, right? And therefore, this income will be affected. Therefore, that will be my expected loss. Okay. Loss frequency, Z. So as I mentioned, it's statistical in nature. How frequently does, let's say, an industry receive this kind of threats, right? You may have seen this in industry reports, as I mentioned before, or your own company may have own register of risks. They maintain the kind of threat they have seen before and how frequently these threats appear. You can do a small exercise. What is the risk of getting, for example, spam email? Yes, from historical data, statistics, or even regression, correct? It can be a regression because sometimes you need to project in the future. You may not have received a risk threat last year, but in the last 5 years prior to that, you have. So you can extrapolate, and then you can get to the current one. Yeah, it's all about statistics. So the example I was trying to say that, let's say the threat we're considering is receiving a spam email, right? Now, there are other risks related to spam email. For example, if you actually click on the spam email, go to that website, and then something you download and so on, that's another thing. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about receiving the spam emails. If you're receiving a spam email, you can actually go to your, because all the emails sent to your, let's say, Gmail or Outlook, unless it's what you expect to find is either those spam emails turn up in your spam mail folder or they come to your inbox. Now, I'm hoping that you have already managed to see which ones went through and you've identified those spam emails. And there are some spam emails a lot of spam emails in the spam email folder, correct? So if you're identifying the loss frequency, you want to see how many of those have actually come to your inbox and you've actually clicked on them and it resulted in something, right? So I'm just giving an example. But the loss magnitude depends on what really happened after that event that caused you to lose that value of the asset. So loss magnitude, okay. So Mamun, you're asking about the loss magnitude, right? 11. This is a part
Yeah,
of,
you're right. Yeah.
this is a fraction of the asset value. So in this case, how we derive 11 is we multiply the loss frequency with the asset value, and then we get 11.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. So we do this thing, and once we do this thing, you can see that the loss magnitude may not depend on the asset value. So for example, the most important assets were number 2 and number 3, but the loss frequency meant that the loss magnitude is less than a relatively lower value asset because their frequency is more. It happens more, right? You get bombarded with spams more than you get a ransomware attack. Okay, so that means you have a bigger possible loss magnitude from this more frequent event. So that means you identify this asset for this. Sorry, now this is no longer an asset. Now this whole thing is a risk. The risk statement is email disruption due to hardware failure on this asset number 1. Okay, and the loss magnitude is this. So now it's a highly important risk. Does it make sense? Okay, so then this is already ordered in terms of risks. You can see the lowest risk is still a risk because the loss frequency is so insignificant, right? 0.01. It hardly ever happens. Lost orders due to web server software failure, and therefore the loss magnitude is just 1. You can safely ignore this risk and you accept this risk. So you don't do anything about it. You write it down that this is a risk that we accept. And all the risks that you accept, you put it in a separate section. You say that these are the risks we have evaluated as acceptable, and therefore we do not mitigate or remove those risks. Okay, here's an example based on calculation. How much time do we have? We are tracking. Abdul Rahman, you said, how do we determine the risk appetite of the company? Again, based on your company's business objectives and goals. And I give some examples. If you haven't joined before, maybe look at the recordings. So here is how we calculate the risks. Just need to go all the time. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So here is an example of information asset A has a value, that means asset value of 50, okay, and has 1 vulnerability. Right? How many vulnerabilities of information asset A? Just 1 vulnerability. And the chances of that vulnerability happening or being affected or exploited is 100%, is a likelihood of 1. It will happen, okay? This vulnerability, due to this vulnerability, this will happen, okay? And there are no current controls. That means there is no steps that you or your organization is taking to remove the vulnerability or mitigate this risk. No controls. So up to here, you understand 2 things. 1, the value of the asset is 50, and the likelihood is 100%. Okay, so very straightforward. But there's one more thing added to it, which is you estimate that your assumptions and the data are 90% accurate. Now, why is this important? Because all of this is basically an estimation, right? There is nothing called 100% likelihood or 0% likelihood, something in between. Although we say 100%, meaning that we are fairly confident this will happen. Okay, that's obvious. But most statisticians will say that, because we haven't seen the end of the world yet. Therefore, we cannot estimate all possibilities of events. That's why there is still a insignificant part that may happen. Anyway, so what we're saying is that there is an estimate of your assumptions of how accurate estimation is. And this is 90% accurate. So your estimation is 90% accurate. What is the 90% we're talking about? We are talking about, let's say, this valuation of 50. Maybe it could be plus minus 10, right? So maybe the value could be between 40 and 60. So that's your range of certainty. Or it could be your likelihood. Maybe the likelihood is 90%, not 100%. And so basically, this is an assumption that the data that you have received has some uncertainty or error, however you want to say it. Uncertainty is the most common term, uncertainty or inaccuracy. So if there is uncertainty, there is 10% uncertainty. Okay, there is 10% uncertainty. If the data is 90% accurate, that means there is 10% uncertainty. You need to take into account this uncertainty as a further risk. Okay, this is you add on risk. Okay, so here, look at the next. We'll work it out, but look at this second one. Second statement is information asset B has a value score of 100 and has 2 vulnerabilities. How many vulnerabilities? 2 vulnerabilities. Now, because we started off with vulnerability 1 in the same page, we don't want to confuse. We just call this vulnerability 2. But it has a second vulnerability, which is vulnerability 3. Information asset B. There are two different information assets of the same company. Information asset B has a value of 100 and has two vulnerabilities. The first vulnerability of information asset B has a chance of occurrence of 50%. And yes, it has a control that mitigates 50% of the risk. It has a chance of occurring 50% and has a control that reduces the risk by 50%. And then it has another vulnerability, vulnerability 3, which is a likelihood of, or chance of occurrence of only 10%, and it has no current controls. And you estimate this overall, assumption on information asset B is around 80% accurate. So how much is uncertainty? 20% uncertainty, correct? Now let's see how we calculate risk from this information. Here, we write it down. We write down the formula as we mentioned before, and this is how we calculate. So the first part, if you remember, information asset A has a value of 50, right? So we multiply 50 by the loss expectancy. Sorry, the frequency estimate. The frequency estimate is 100%, so it will happen, right? So 50 times 1 is 50. And then there are no controls. If there was any control, that control would have reduced our risk. This is the main risk. Remember, this is the main risk. The main risk is the value of the asset times the likelihood occurrence of the vulnerability, and this is the impact. So this is basically your risk amount. From this risk amount, you can deduct the portion that would be controlled by anything. For example, an antivirus software, a firewall. What percentage of that would be mitigated? Of that risk would be mitigated. This term explains that term, and that amount gets subtracted from your main risk value. Now, in this case, there is none. So this whole term results in 0. And then there is an uncertainty. We talked about uncertainty, right? In the previous slide, we mentioned, let's have a look again. 50% of the value is 50, likelihood of 100. And there is a 10% uncertainty. So we calculate this uncertainty as a portion of the risk itself. This is the risk, so it's 10% risk. So we add this 10% risk to the overall risk. Therefore, 50% plus 10% is 55. So therefore, the whole risk of asset A due to that vulnerability and no controls and assumption is 55. Now, if you do the same thing for asset B, there are two vulnerabilities, so you need to calculate them separately. For vulnerability B, you multiply the asset value with the likelihood, which is 50%. But this vulnerability has, this vulnerability has a what? As a control, which reduces the risk by 50%. You see how it reduces the risk by 50%? So you can see that 50% of that risk gets subtracted from this one. So this essentially becomes half the risk. But then, because our calculations, we are uncertain up to 20%, therefore we have to add on the uncertainty risk to it. And then the 50 minus 25 is half of it, 25. Then we add this additional risk of uncertainty, and then the risk due to the vulnerability 2 for asset B becomes 35. Similarly, for asset B, it becomes 12. Correct? Now, if you look at these two assets of the same organization, which asset has the most risk? Obviously, asset A, right? Asset A has the most risk, yeah. And therefore, you should control this risk first. If you don't have funds, let's say if there is not enough money for you to have controls for this one, currently there is no control for this one, right? Asset B vulnerability 3, you have no controls. Let's say you add a control, and then you can further reduce this risk from 12 to 6. Let's say you can bring it down to 6. Is that going to be a lot more beneficial to you? This is called cost-benefit analysis of controls. And this is something we're going to see next. Asset B should be 35 plus 12. Yes, 47. Still less than asset A.
Sorry, can I just check why do you add the uncertainty as an additional risk?
Okay, the uncertainty is an additional risk because your estimates are not completely, you're not confident about the accuracy of your estimate. So therefore, we are on caution rather than on our calculations, our estimates. So basically, you see, if this, in the first case, in asset A, if we didn't add this 10% uncertainty, then our risk would be simply the likelihood times frequency, correct? That would be our estimate. However, as I said before, we may not be totally sure about the frequency, or we may not be even sure about our estimate of our values. So whatever the case is, this uncertainty helps you have a lower bound, a cushion above your risk impact. So this cushion is very, very helpful. Yeah.
Okay, so whatever you are not certain, you make the worst assumption, so you assume that 20% is going to happen, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
You add it to the value of the risk. That's it, and become safe. Some information sources are very, very accurate, and you can rely, therefore, you can reduce your uncertainty to a low value. And other places, when you rely on different kinds of information sources, maybe not related to your company or even your industry, maybe you have to estimate the risk a little bit more. Okay. Okay, so this is what you get. Information asset classification worksheet, the asset relative value I told you about. Then a weighted criteria analysis worksheet, which is basically a TVA matrix, and a ranked vulnerability risk worksheet, which is basically after you calculate your risks, then you find out which risks are the most important, right? Now we look into controls. Okay, now we look into the controls. So there are 5 strategies of controls, okay, for each risk. It can be either defense, transference, mitigation, acceptance, or termination. Anyone want to hazard a guess which one is what?
Defense is obviously preventative.
Yes. Oh, no. Defense is not just preventive. It is everything else. So defense is basically the steps you take before an event, steps you take during an event, and steps you take after. Oh, there's mitigation as well, right? So, okay, so let's go there. Just one second. Here. Defense attempts to prevent, right? So if we have mitigation, then it's during the event, right? Okay, so here, the prevent and exploitation of the vulnerability accomplished through countering threats and so on, removing asset vulnerabilities, limiting asset access, and adding protective safeguards. 3 common safeguard methods of risk avoidance is application of policy, education, and technology. So this is defense is completely preventive. Thanks for that. Now let's go to mitigation.
So, Professor, like antivirus is a defensive one, right?
Sorry, which one?
I'm saying antivirus is a defensive one, right?
Antivirus does both things, right? Antivirus detects. Antivirus has 2 modalities of operation. One is when it tries to identify something that's new to your system, right, and prevents it. And the other modality is your system has already been infected. Maybe your antivirus wasn't working, or your antivirus didn't have the signatures that it needed to identify it. Now you're running it post-infection, and therefore it's actually removing the infections. So one can happen as preventive, and the other one can be detective, where during or after infection has happened. So both of them, yeah. So just wanted to compare the defense with the mitigation. Mitigation is more about, well, even after prevention, something is still going to happen. So what do we do in real time or post-attack to mitigate the effect of the risk? Okay. So anyway, so let's go one by one. So defense, we talked about prevention. Next is transference. So due to the insurance companies, now there is a possibility that you can, rather than accepting the risk for yourself, you transfer the risk to the insurance company. Okay. So the risk is still there. Remember, the risk is still there, except someone else is owning that risk, or someone else will be paying for that risk. Similarly, for example, if you have a piece of hardware or even a software in your own premises, on-prem, you may want to delegate it somewhere else. For example, a cloud company. The cloud company could be a SaaS or a PaaS, and they can take care of your things in a way so that their infrastructure is under harm's way, not yours. What you're providing is service. So except for availability issues, and in most cases, clouds do not suffer from the availability as we do in normal circumstances. So in most cases, you may have transferred certain classes of vulnerability, certain classes of threats to a secondary organization. You can think of it as a transference of risk. So risk is still there, except someone else is owning it and looking for it. So Mamun asked, setting up a firewall is an example of defense? Yes, that is an example of defense. So transparency is all clear. Risk is still there.
Sorry.
Sure,
I think you've given a good example of shifting to another organization, like data center or cloud, as you mentioned. But would you by any chance have an example of like shifting risk for another asset?
So say it again.
So the first line in this slide says the strategy attempts to shift risk to other assets. Do you have an example of that?
Oh, okay, good find. Yeah. So basically, you have an inherent risk to an asset, right? You have an asset that is inherently risky. You opt for another asset that is inherently lesser risky. So you transfer the risk from one asset to another asset. And you only do that because your perceived understanding of the risk involved in the next asset or the other asset is less than your primary asset.
Yeah, I get that. But what's an example? So I can
Can I give an example? When we connect to a web server and we prevent users to connect to database directly, is that something like we use the shift risk to other assets from database to web server?
Say it again, Sam. Say it again. I'm interested to hear. So I didn't.
So basically, when we design like a web server or a solution, we give access to web server to users rather than directly connect to database. So web server,
I see. Okay, so what you're saying is that instead of accessing the database directly, you go through the web service, like an API call or something. Like an API call can manage the backend database connection while giving you a snapshot of the data that you're seeking. I don't think this is exactly what Shah is looking for. I think Shah is looking for a concrete example where the risk of one asset class is higher than risk of another asset class. Okay, I can think of one example. For example, for let's say you're using vehicle. Let's take the vehicle, right? There are different types of vehicle. You can travel by road on your car, or using a truck, or using a taxi, or something else, right? So you're still using a vehicle, but some may be more safer than others, if I can say so. So this is like you're not avoiding using that asset class, but you're moving to a different asset that basically has lesser risk. But anyway, I wouldn't pick too much on it, except that the primary example of risk transference is basically to an insurance company. As long as you understand that the risk is still there, but someone else is owning that risk, that should be understood.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question regarding defense and mitigation?
Yep.
So basically, defense is about reducing, risk is about likelihood and impact. So defense is kind of more focusing on likelihood, whereas mitigation kind of focusing on minimizing the impact. Is that kind of what it's trying to say?
Defense is very broad. So it's
So you
very, very
can
preventive. It's
minimize
not
impact.
just defense not only looks into the likelihood, defense also looks into the basically not just the likelihood. For example, if you know that the vulnerability exists, a defense could be completely removing the vulnerability. Okay, preventing this thing from happening at all. But
Isn't it
mitigate.
termination then?
Sorry?
The termination to not use that. Oh, okay.
Termination is
To
yes,
not
termination, correct. So
to
termination,
avoid
no,
that.
just 1 second. So let me just go through this and then we can look at,
Okay.
so transparency is clear, right? So we move on to the next one, mitigation. I explained before, mitigation is basically taking any steps to reduce the impact of the threat or of the risk. Now, as I said, risk has two components, as you mentioned before. The value of the asset, the frequency, and the frequency of the event, as well as the impact of it. And impact actually depends on what? Exposure factor, right? How much of this asset is exposed to the risk? That you can control as well as the likelihood. So sometimes you have no control of the likelihood, right? So earthquakes will happen so many times, but you can control whether you're on a earthquake prone area or a less earthquake prone area, whether you're using building materials up to a certain scale in the Richter scale, or you take other steps to mitigate the effect of the risk. Maybe you have good plans to evacuate as soon as this happens, and you have regular drills and so on. So part of that would be basically your defense. These things would be your defense, these drills and things like that. Mitigation would be that if it happens, what do you do next? If it happens, then what you're doing is you're basically applying these risk controls so that your your risk is minimized. The effect of the risk is minimized. Does it make sense?
So looking at the mitigation, involve three of the plans, which does that mean the actually mitigation is not action before this happens, but just making the plan and then
plan. That's right. So whatever you're going to do during the incident or after the incident is actually written in the plan. You just write those plans beforehand, but you follow those plans during the mitigation stage.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
So,
okay.
So defense could be an actions to lower the risk, but yeah, got it. Thank you.
Actually, just a point, right? Usually with risk management or risk kind of management, right? Normally, from what I usually, they don't talk about all these 5 types of action, right? Normally, you either accept it, you avoid it, you transfer, or you reduce, right? Normally, people don't talk about defense and mitigate. They don't differentiate between that. I haven't seen a lot of places where they talk about that. Yeah, just something I.
So I have already given you the reference that you can look at the book.
It's in there. Okay.
Yeah. It's already there. But having said that, you don't have to, when you're writing up your assignment, you don't have to say that classify. You can just say what are the controls, and that actually speaks for itself. So if your control has both a defensive part and mitigate part, so be it. You don't have to spell it out, but this is just for clarification of what can be done in terms of controls. Of course, one important aspect of risk is that you can accept the risk. So if you accept the risk, that means you don't deal with it. You accept the risk as it is, knowing full well what are the consequences going to be. You're not going to take any mitigating action for that risk. Does it make sense? Okay. And the last one, the termination, I think someone asked about it. Termination is basically we avoid that business process or remove that asset that we think will undergo that risk. We terminate that risk. We don't go. So, for example, if you're venture capital. So let's say there's a startup company, right? And then before they actually go into a listed company, they do the risk analysis. They see that based on the kind of revenue they expect to have and the kind of downside, that means their expenses and so on, means that this is not going to be a sound investment. So they terminate it. 90% of startups fail for this reason, because the risk of going forward is more than the kind of upside they can visualize. So termination is not about detection and eliminating a risk. No, termination is about avoiding business activities that introduce that uncorrect. So you can think about acceptance and termination as the two opposite sides of the same coin. Acceptance is we accept the risk, and terminate is that we stop doing that part of that business or operation or asset that involve that risk. Maybe because the cost of control is much higher than the value of the asset or something like that. Yes, unsustainable. Okay, makes sense?
Sorry, you said it includes assets as well, right? Like just avoid the asset.
Yes, it also avoids the asset. Yes.
Okay, not just activity. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so here you can see that there's a summary of this discussion that we had. Defense, the kind of what we compared is so this Whitman is basically related to NIST risk management framework, but more importantly to NIST Special Publication 800-30 Revision 1. That was sort of the most aligned, alignment with an accepted risk management framework. But this is how you correlate the terminologies. The terminologies of defense, transference, mitigation, acceptance, termination, if you're not familiar, is basically from this book. But how does it compare with other terminologies from other competing frameworks? Is basically, this is an example. So defense is known as research and acknowledgement under NIST special publication. And ISACA in 27001, it's called treat. Transference is transfer, same thing. Mitigation is limiting risks and planning risks, and partial tolerate of 27001. Acceptance is tolerate, and then termination is termination. And also it's known as risk avoidance in NIST SP. Therefore, that thing that I mentioned, that if there's something is risky, we avoid that venture, we avoid that asset, and so on altogether. It's not a result of being infected or affected first, and then we take action. So if this is part of a continuous process, whenever we realize that something is not worth protecting or not worth or doing business about, we avoid that. This is called risk termination in this scenario. Okay. So here is an example of now justifying controls. So for any management of vulnerability, we may have more than one way of mitigating the risk. So now imagine that we were talking about that house with the gold bars in it, with that with that open window. That's that asset and that risk scenario. What will be the controls? We already discussed about some controls, right? We talked about some detective controls, some preventive controls like dogs and so on. What would be a risk transference in this case? An example of risk transference. Insurance, of course, insurance, right? Yeah. And so moving it to a bank, would it be a risk transference or a shift? Shift is still within transference though, but anyway, if someone wants to consider shifting a risk as another category, then they can consider shifting the location of the asset to another place is a kind of risk transference. Right. So, Or you can have a vault inside your own house, right? And secure that vault so that no one can take it out of the window. And of course, you can't unlock that vault either. So what kind of step would that be?
Defense.
Sorry, Pasha?
Would it be defense?
Yes, so that's a preventive control. So that's a defensive control as well. Correct. Okay, now the reason I mention these different types of controls, which one will you apply? Are you going to keep your window open and let your gold get stolen, and then you can claim money from the insurance for the price of the gold? Maybe it's not gold, maybe it's jewelry. Maybe it has got more sentimental values associated than price. So the kind of control that you want to apply, maybe you want to apply multiple controls. That's fine. But if you wanted to prioritize the control, which control would be more effective and less expensive?
Closing the window and locking it.
There you go. Because the premise was the vulnerability that exists because of an open window. You probably want to just buy a padlock or a shutter, and then that protects most of the things. However, having said that, you still need to justify the controls, and that's where we are at. And when you want to do it quantitatively, this is how you find out the justification of controls. So remember we talked about the previous example, right? Let's say now we have an example like a website, and the website has an estimated value of $1 million. It has an estimated value of $1 million, right? And a deliberate act of sabotage, or let's say vandalism and so defacement and so on. In this scenario, that indicates that around 10% of the website value would be diminished, okay, due to that attack. Then, as you calculate the single loss expectancy, single loss expectancy is equal to the value of the asset times the exposure factor. So this is about the $1 million time one-time hit of 10% gives you a loss of $100,000 for that website, for that single event. Understood? Now, consider how many times this is going to happen in a year. So this is the likelihood, right? The likelihood estimate. How many times is it going to happen a year? If we know that the annual rate of occurrence is going to be half, that means we expect this to happen once every 2 years. How many times? Every 2 years, we expect this loss to happen. This is our estimate. We have found it from somewhere, right? Every 2 years, this is going to happen. So if it happens every 2 years, the chances of happening in 1 year is half, correct? So this is known as the annualized rate of occurrence. So which means half. Then we need to multiply it with the annual rate of occurrence. So to calculate the annualized loss expectancy, we multiply the SLE with ARO, and therefore we get 50,000. It's basically half of that one, because this event will happen every 2 years. So every 1 year, your loss will be 50,000. Okay? Understood? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Now imagine that we have a control. Previous was no control. Now we have a control. So if we have a control, we need to calculate the cost of the control and how much.
Sorry, Dr.
Yes.
I think I might have missed something or might be confused. But if you just go back one slide. So
Yep.
in that slide, we're justifying controls, but I thought like in all the previous calculations we're doing, like using the frequency and the impact, and then once we multiply those and have that table on the right hand side, we had those numbers, and I thought that's what we solved last time.
Yeah, that's different. That's actually calculating your risk. Here we're trying to find the benefit, the cost benefit analysis of controls is different. Here you can see the exposure factor and the asset value. This gives you what? How much loss you're expecting from it, right? This is your frequency. Sorry,
Yeah.
this is not your frequency. This is your frequency. This is your impact. So you're asking two things, right? risk equal to likelihood times impact. So likelihood is your SLE, and the impact is basically your exposure factor times your value. Does it make sense?
So sorry, what's the difference between that and this?
What do you mean that? I'm talking about this one, right? So we're explaining calculation of risks. For risk, we need likelihood and impact. The impact is this one, asset value times exposure factor. That's your impact. And likelihood is this one. The likelihood expressed in terms of the value of the value of the asset. That's the likelihood interpreted as the value of the asset is $50,000. So this is used for calculating cost benefit analysis of controls or justifying controls. Yes, Sam?
I'm not able to see your mouse pointer. I'm not sure if this is my problem or yours. Now I can see now.
Okay.
Previously, I couldn't see because you just mentioned this.
Oh, I think, I think my mouse, because it's a multi, what do you call it, monitor, it sometimes vanishes. So
yeah,
I have to remember bringing it back. Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks. Yeah. So here we're talking about the CBA. You can see for the CBA, the cost benefit analysis of the control, there are two things. One is whatever we calculated before, like $50,000 or whatever is our loss. Now, if we implement a control, that means it's going to reduce our loss. However, we also need to consider that there is a cost of implementing the control. So the benefit is basically reduced by the amount of the value of the control. So let's look at a concrete example here. So now let's say we take the values from our previous scenario where now in this case, previously the annual rate of occurrence was 0.5. That means the risk was due once every 2 years. Now, let's say we have a control, whatever the control, maybe a web application firewall. What is a web application firewall? It's a defense mechanism to stop and identify numerous threats to our web server, web application firewall. And we talk about it more in next week. But if we apply web application firewall, maybe now it will be able to catch most of those previous threats, and therefore the likelihood goes even lower. Likelihood of attack goes even lower. So the previous likelihood was 0.5. Let's say it halves to 0.25. What does it really mean? It means now the same attack is expected to happen once every 4 years rather than once every 2 years. Does it make sense? So the control is now decreasing the likelihood. Yes, Prasad, you wanted to say something?
No, I just said yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So the control has that effect, correct? Now see, look at the calculation, what it does. You have this, now that control of web application firewall has a cost involved. It's $10,000. So anyone raise your hand. Do you think $10,000 is a lot of money for a control? Yes or no? It's a hypothetical scenario, right? So it could be whether it's a lot or not. It would depend on the business, of course, right? Whether they can afford it or not. If there was no limit to your budget, then everything is affordable. So it's not a big deal. Just to give you an example, you know, Microsoft Copilot, because many of you are from AI, Microsoft Copilot has a part related to security. So there is a Microsoft Security Copilot. And when it started up, maybe 3 years ago, it was sort of being rolled out with Microsoft's business partners. There are some selective partners who opted to trial this for the organization. Do you know how much it cost? $500,000 a year just to trial Microsoft Copilot for security. So this is relative, right? But yes, some controls can be more expensive than others. So it's vitally, very, very important to include the cost of this control. So Okay, here in the current case, then because of the application of the control, your sort of ARO is minimized to 0.25. Now, if you want to calculate CBA, you need to write down your ALE prior, which you have already done, $50,000. Now the ALE post is this one. This is how you calculate the ALE post. ALE post equal to single loss expectancy times annual rate of occurrence. Same thing. So your single loss expectancy is still the same. The only thing that reduced is annualized rate of occurrence, and therefore it is now 25,000, basically half of 50,000, which is 25,000. So now it's very straightforward. Your CBA is equal to 50,000 minus 25,000, which is the new amount, minus 10,000 because that's an additional cost for you, cost of the control. It gives you a net benefit of $15,000. Is it good or bad?
Good.
Very silently, Pusat. It's good. Okay. It's good because this is an amount you're expected to lose every year due to that risk that you have. If you didn't have that control. If you didn't have that control, this $15,000 would not be with you. So it will be gone. Okay? So that's the benefit of this analysis. Any questions so far? Unfortunately, we need to move on. So this was the most important aspect of today's discussion because it related to your assignment. So now we can go into the assignment and so on. Just 1 second. There's nothing more to see here.
Sorry, how do we
There's nothing more to see. Yeah.
How
Go
do
ahead.
how do we design the frequency of the occurrence?
How do we decide the frequency of occurrence? I told you it's from different types of sources, from statistics, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Sunil says, how ALE post calculate can you say once? ALE post. Oh, ALE post. Yeah. So look at this example again. This is your ALE post. ALE post basically in this particular circumstances is because of a reduced ARO. The annual rate of occurrence, instead of being 0.5 once every 2 years, now it happens once every 4 years. Therefore, it's 0.25. And that resulted in a reduced sort of impact. So totally, you have a loss of 25,000. So if you have a previous loss of 50,000 minus the new loss of 25,000 minus the cost of control of 10,000, you have a net benefit of 15,000. It's as if you're earning $15,000. Actually, you're saving $50,000, which is the same as earning $15,000 though. There's no reason to think otherwise. So yeah. Okay, so all done. So this is all done. So let's just stop sharing this. And let's go to, oopsie. Just 1 second. Okay, now let me show you the assignment. Where are the assignments? Okay, just need to take it here. Oh no, it was here. It's fine. Okay. Okay, let's. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Print over here. Okay. Now, the first thing I'm showing you is the risk management reading material, the reference material, chapter 4, Whitman. So this will be made available to you unless it's already clickable. I think it should be clickable thing on your assessment 2 page, but if not, I will add it soon after. So you can see all of these things that I've discussed over here. So what I've done is just basically clarified most of these things, okay? Even the risk calculations are here. Everything is here. Okay, the next thing is this is your project instructions, okay? So this was made available to you some time ago, long time ago, but I'm just trying to tell you what needs to be done here, right? So here you can see there is a scenario mentioned. Basically, not even a full scenario, it's partial scenario. The scenario is you need to build a scenario. So consider an organization, a company, a business, a use case where the developers or whoever is running the business, they wanted to install Claude Bot or OpenClaw on their servers or machines. And those of you who don't know what Claude Bot or OpenClaw is, it's a automated tool, AI-based tool to do stuff. For example, managing your system, developing code, doing anything an LLM assistant you can imagine nowadays would be able to do. It can do it. Plus, it has added benefit of being persistent, meaning it can manage its own memory, it can manage its goal, it can self-improve, it can communicate, it can send emails, it can browse, it can literally do stuff for you. And also, from time to time, it can remind you to do things, or from time to time, it will do stuff and then update you. And there are many different channels. That's also part of things you need to look into, how it works. You need to look into all of these things because security implications are how it works. So it can send email, it can communicate with you via WhatsApp, Telegram, and so on. There are multiple ways of avenues of communication, and those are actually built into the Claude bot. So it looks like you can use a mobile phone, and even at work, you can send a message for it to do work. You don't have to actually, secure shell your way in a secured manner and do it, on your own system. You can see literally be anywhere. So these are the there's some benefits of it. Obviously, that's why many people have been using it. But there are huge risks, security implications as well. And I want you to investigate all possible angles where those security risks can come from. It could be coming from hackers. It could be coming from nation states. It could be coming from our businesses, organizations, and so on. And what are the risks? So part of that thing is that you have to come up with an organization in mind or institution. These are just examples. There don't need to be university faculty. I don't want everyone to be looking at universities. You can choose your own scenario. It can be a real scenario. It can be an hypothetical scenario, but it needs to be consistent with our expectation of that business or organization enterprise. Okay, so what is expected is you write a report. There is a sort of a 2,000 word limit. It's not very, very strictly enforced. I mean, you're not really penalized for it, but expectation is that it's not too big or not too small either, right? So it needs to have all the components of this. The word counts obviously do not include your references, your figures, your tables, or even appendices. So sort of it gives you an idea. So this is how how a Claude bot or OpenClaw works with skills and how malicious skill can be used. For example, skills are basically the kind of algorithms or pseudocode that the Claude bot follows, or instructions. Let's put it this way: instructions that the bot follows to achieve a particular goal. So, for example, if someone is into trading, let's say they want to do day trading, or they want to do a short-term trading or a crypto trading, then they would have a skill description which says that, look, this is what you need to do, this is your goal, this is how you do it, and roughly I mean, you don't have to give very precise goals because these are large language models. They understand our intent in many cases. And then you can say, okay, not only this, but you can also use these tools. Maybe you can use an API call. You can actually log in using my credentials. These are my credentials, or these credentials are stored here, depending on how this is done. Anyway, so sometimes they also import skills from publicly available skills repositories. There are many people in the open source world who write skills for others' benefits and upload them in a repository. You can actually download those skills. But some of the skills are really, really harmful because they actually hide instructions inside the data. So they hide instructions within instructions to do something bad. And there have been some publications and research which shows that these imported skills are malicious in nature and they can easily bypass any kind of any other thing, because they actually come into your own network on your own machine, and they have full liberty of using whatever tools they want to use, and they can actually force the LLM to do things that you didn't want it to do. So kind of like prompt injection, but using skills. Yeah, so this is how it shows what kind of things, but this is just like a starting point. I don't expect you to just rely on this information. The whole point is doing research, is going out and researching about this phenomenon of CloudBot OpenClaw, how it evolved and what kind of role it plays, and also what are the threats that it poses to a particular scenario, right? This is the whole exercise. Now, to do that, you need to understand the business viewpoint and stakeholder context. So normally in an ideal case, like in a real world, in a practical scenario, you'd actually go and talk to the stakeholders. You can't do it here. I don't expect, nobody's expecting you to do that here. So you assume and understand or give references of what the business's viewpoint would be. For example, the viewpoint of, when I talk about viewpoint, I'm talking about the security viewpoint, right? So for example, that establishes your risk appetite. So university could be something, defense would be a different, financial institution have a different viewpoint of their businesses and their on the security goals, right? And the risk posture. So that's the business and stakeholder context. You mentioned it in your own words. Next is, of course, the obvious asset identification and valuation. We talked about this process in detail today. So how do you evaluate different assets? How do you prioritize the assets? Next, you identify the risks, estimate the risks, calculate the risk, and prioritize those risks. Okay. This is where you can, some of you would actually employ this thing. So basically go through the slides that we have in the LMS and try to understand how risk can be, threats can be identified, threats can be prioritized, threat vulnerability asset matrix can be developed, and then a risk matrix can be created, based on which you can identify the most important, important risks. That is the result of your risk prioritization, identification, estimation, and prioritization process. So at the end of it comes the risk matrix. This is a matrix aligned to your scales with the identified scenarios plotted or tabulated. So I will be showing you the template that will make things a little bit more real. Okay, just 1 second. Okay, what else? Then is the most important thing, which is risk treatment and residual risk. How do you plan? How do you propose, as a consultant, as a risk analyst, how do you propose that certain types of this kind of risk can be defended from, that means avoided, or it can be mitigated, or it can be transferred, any class of risk control? What do you need to do? How do you treat the risk? In general, it's called risk treatment. How do you treat the risk? And what is the comparative cost of the risk treatment? Okay. Now, I'm not talking about exact science that go and find out the exact value of these things. Just like you didn't have to find the exact value of the assets, you opted for relative value of the assets. You can also tell us the relative value of the controls, and you can use those relative values to establish which control should be applied in this particular risk mitigation scenario. Okay.
Excuse
Uh,
me, Dr.
yeah.
Mohan. You have talked about, I may have missed that. You say talk to the stakeholder. Do you mean?
No, I said you don't have to talk to the stakeholder. You don't have any opportunity here to talk to the stakeholder. You assume what is the stakeholder's position or viewpoint, or learn from literature or industry reports. Industry reports are a good place to go for. Go to industry bodies, look for the kind of things, the risk posture. Yes, Sam?
The company itself can be a fake one, or needs to be a real company, because
No, it doesn't.
sometimes
It can be a hypothetical company, but it needs to be representative of a company in that industry. Okay.
so it can be fake.
Yes,
company.
fake. You need to put all your assumptions in. Yes. Okay, so the treatment overview, a concise table or a figure summarizing post-treatment status of top risks. So even after you have treated your risks, then there's still some risk available, right? And then you summarize that in the post-treatment status. This is called treatment overview. Conclusions, recommendations, what do you suggest that people do under circumstances. References, APA 7 intake citations, reference this as it's mentioned here. Evidence expectations. Now this is important. Different people will write it differently, correct? The assignment, it can be a very simple one. It can be more researched one. So the more research you put in, the better quality is going to be, and that will be reflected by the quality and the quantity of evidence that you have associated with your work. I'm just giving you that heads up. So if you rely on assumptions, also you need to explain them, but it's best to rely on statistics and reports rather than just relying on your assumptions, because your assumptions could be incorrect. So there are some starting points of references, but obviously this is just very fraction.
Sorry, what's an example of that?
Example of what?
Mentioned, sorry, just scroll up a little bit. Yeah, here the evidence expectations. Like
so here you can see support high priority likelihood estimates with credible sources. For example, vendor security research, advisories. You go to CVE databases, NVD databases, regulatory guidance, reputable studies. So that's your research. That's basically where you find this information from.
So you mean stuff like, let's say, so like in your example of like the spam email, what's the likelihood of spam email as an example? Like you find a credible source.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What source do you go to find the threat frequency of spam email? There you go.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Make sure that you're particular about the structure. So here is an example of the template. So I provided this template because I don't want many of you to do it differently. This closely aligns with the marking rubric as well. Let's see the marking. This is the marking rubric. You can see there are a few criteria. Basically, the questions you're asked in the assessment is basically reflected in the criterion. There's 10 mark for scope, objectives, and there are different grades depending on how well it has been done. There's business viewpoint, asset identification, valuation. Please go through this at your own pace. Risk identification estimation, 25 marks. Risk treatment residual is 20 marks. That's because this is probably going to take your bulk of your time, the risk estimates and so on. That's why this is slightly less. Asset identification is also important, and so on. Anyway, so the template looks like this. There's an executive summary, right? Don't forget to mention your student name, number, and so on. Introduction, the problem statement, what's the purpose and objective, scope and assumptions, methodology and estimation approach. Now here is basically, this is an information that will help us understand how you have, what sources you have relied upon. How did you investigate these sources? Where did you go? Did you find this from internet? Did you go to this place? Did you go to a risk register? What are the different sources? What is your methodology and approach, right? And so on. This is where you put your approach here of doing the risk assessment. Then you talk about the business viewpoint. So you can reflect the business viewpoint in terms of a table like this, like the different stakeholders, what is their interest. Janet, you mentioned about basing this on organization. You're most welcome to do it, but maybe you hide the identity of that organization for privacy or internal, because we don't want to get into trouble. Is anyone leaking internal problems, right? Issues. So maybe you abstract it. Yeah, thanks, Janet. Yeah. Asset identification and valuation. How do you develop the asset register, the valuation method? For example, we use the asset relative value table we described before. So from that, this is the asset register. So we are expecting as a mixed qualitative, quantitative risk assessment process. Someone asked this question. Does not include an RSCI metric. This is relevant. No, it's only relevant what's mentioned here, not beyond it. How many risk treatments? So if you ask how many risk treatment, that all depends on the scenario. Your scenario will be different from other scenario. So there is no lower bound, upper bound, but it, it cannot be, again, your guiding factor will be how much you have. This is, no, this will not be more than 2,000 words. So just make sure that you have those in mind, that you're not putting too much stress on yourself and also the marker. There's no minimum we need to aim for. I don't want to put a minimum on it. I cannot, because the scenario is developed by you and every scenario is different. Yeah. If you want to be bold and just go with nothing, that's probably the minimum, right? Or 1 or 2. But it has to make sense in the perspective that you're offering. If it doesn't make sense, then you don't get good marks for it. Okay. Risk identification, estimation, prioritization, likelihood. Okay, here what they're saying is there is a process, right? A quantification process of likelihood. Here the likelihood is quantized. Likelihood. So why final exam? No, I think you're talking about different things. We talk about the final exam later on. Let's concentrate on the assignment, right? Are we on the same board? We are talking about the assignment here. Good. Right. So in the assignment here, the likelihood scale is for your benefit rather than calculating, let's say, 0.2, 0.3. And we're talking about here, you can estimate the likelihood in terms of scale between 1 and 5. And so let's say 5 being the most likely and 1 being the least likely. And the impact also can be in a scale between 1 to 5. So 5 being the most impactful and 1 being the least impactful. Why you need this is once you do the TVA, right? Once you do the TVA, this is the TVA, okay? Once you do the TVA, and the next step after the TVA is to generate this 5 times 5 metrics like this one. So remember the TVA? The TVA was the threat vulnerability asset matrix. That one is basically this one, 4.2. And after 4.2, you come to 4.3. In 4.3, you use those values in this scale. In this scale of severity of impact from 5 to 1 and likelihood of the occurrence from 5 to 1, you need to put those risks, those important risks from the TVA over here. Okay? So just one more step beyond the TVA metrics. And this will help you to sort of quantize rather than be very, very particular about the risk value. Here you can quantize it. Next step, after you have found all the risks and the severity of the risks, you can now plan about the treatment. What are the controls you're going to use? Preventive, detective, control, and so on. What are the justifications of using this control? And what is the expected effect? Okay.
Is the treatment plan like with numbers or is it text?
So this is text. Justification is text. Yeah, but
Okay.
so basically here, the numbers only come because you have a relative order in the treatment. Some treatments you prefer because they're less expensive or more potent, and so on. And that's how you write those risks. This is the risk. This is the same risk register. You have got this one. You see this risk register, R1. Let's say you have got R1 to R7. Let's say you have got 7 risks, right? If you have 7 risks, the 7 risks will be here, somewhere here written. Maybe R1 here, R2 here, R3, whatever, right? And then you treat those risks according to those most severe risks, all the risk over here on this coordinate. So you write those risks and find the control. And then I would expect that there's a discussion why this control is better than other controls. So that's where that should be mentioned in the treatment overview 5.2. You talk about those relative importance of controls, why you use this, and so on. No, Gaurav, this is the first. This template is for this one. We have a unique assessment every year, so there is no sample assessment for this one, unfortunately. That's why you have a template. So you have to go by it. If anything more, then I'll be writing your assessment for you. So the template is already there. Okay.
Can I ask a question, Doctor?
Yes.
Because I saw many places ask us to put tables in, and the table is not counted in the words. So that's possible. I write like 500 words in a table, talk about water treatment. But, But that's not counted in that 2,000 words.
Yeah, so that's why we are not very concerned at the lower bound of it. We are more concerned if it's too much. That's why. Having said that, there are opportunities for you to write. It may look like a very small report because nothing is filled. None of the section 1 is complete. Nothing is written, right? Also, discussion around the treatment plan. This is going to be a bit longer than just 2 lines or 1 line. So yes, so there is room to write, but of course, there is some text within the text is representative of your analysis. You have analyzed this information and you have gathered it. And be mindful of the references. References are quite important and will be verified. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
What else? We have discussed about all things related to the assignment.
Do we have another session where we'll be doing such exercises, like with you?
Yes, not with me, but in the workshop with Dr. Akhtar. He will be going
to the lab. So lab 3 will be
more
doing
workshop.
such risk assessment.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, nice.
You'll be doing some risk-based things as well as business continuity planning, which I didn't have enough time to cover anyway. So you'll be hopefully looking at that one. Sorry, I have to go to we have already gone past, right? So I have to stop here. So I will pass on my business continuity plan in the workshop lab, which is going to happen this Thursday and Friday. So please ensure that you turn up for the labs or workshops or watch the recording, because the business continuity plan part of it will be mentioned there, although it's not part of your assignment. It's not at all part of your assignment, but it will be talked about there. You'll also do some. So someone is asking, can we assignment reference the ISM or do we only to miss CSF? No, you can reference anything. You can reference anything. Yeah, but it's best to correlate with things that you have studied. That will show us how much of that content you have understood. Okay. Any other questions?
Sorry, which lab session is the one that we need to be careful of? Obviously, all of them, but then is this the next one coming?
Yeah, I think on Thursday, right? I think Akhtar normally records the first one, but doesn't matter. So come in any one of them. He will be running the same thing again.
Yeah, thank you.
So Gaurav asks, when do you attempt the assignment? Write it now. Start writing now. Although you've got until end of week 5. So even now you've got 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks left to finish it. But the sooner you submit it, the better. Although I don't think we can start marking or saying it because we don't even know that's your final submission.
What I meant was like, is there anything that is covered in module like 4, 5, 6?
No. You can start doing it
Okay,
now.
so 1, 2, 3, like what we have done so far is good enough for the assignment.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So which weeks is assessment based on? Oh, as Gaurav asks, you can use what you have learned so far. So if someone is actually submitting in week 5, you can still use materials covered in week 4, week 5, doesn't matter, because the essential thing is risk assessment. But what you find out more detail, because the more you learn in cybersecurity, the more it will give you ideas, more it will give you information. But of course, I mean, you are expected to do risk assessment based on the risk assessment topics that have been covered, so you would know how to do it. Most of it is research. Yeah. What else? Okay, so remember, this is due on end of week 5, and end of week 5 you already have a week 5 submission quiz due, right? So make sure that you don't struggle with the same deadline for 2 assessments. This is intentionally given a long time so that you finish it beforehand. Okay, either you finish week 5 quiz before or the assessment before. Either way, don't struggle and complain, look, I couldn't finish because 2 deadlines. No, lead time is the most important thing. Okay, if that's all, then I'll say goodbye. And if there's any question, please send them on the discussion forum.
It's about the AI. It says no AI at all. So
yes, no AI. What I mean by no AI, this is not quiz, right? This is not an exam. So this is an assessment that is actually trying to see how much you have understood the material. So when I say no AI, I'm saying that do not use AI to write your assignment. AI should not be used as a primary source of information. You should always verify whether it's Google search. Google also has AI in it, right? So we cannot avoid that. But whatever information it provides, you double check and verify and do the research on your own.
Gotcha. Thanks.
But the hypothetical company, for example, we can use AI to get. Yeah.
Sorry?
Like, for example, the hypothetical company we can use AI to get that and the assets and stuff, right?
No, I don't think so. Hypothetical company it's an AI hypothetical company. You should come up with your own hypothetical company. So there are limits to, so AI is a tool, true, but when I say no AI, there should be no AI in the representation of the assignment as you submit it. That's what I'm trying to say. You can use it as a tool to gather information and so on, like a search tool, but you should not be representing those information directly in the thing without verification of it first and undergoing rigorous double checking. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, thank you. Bye.